Now, you'll probably understand why I don't think, as much as the word prorogation has become increasingly offensive because of previous prorogations, this one actually makes some sense because of what happened through the spring session. So my last meetings in Central Saanich for town halls were in January, and I updated you on the fall session. In the spring session of Parliament, that's traditionally the time we have a budget. This spring was no exception. We had the budget for 2013. The interesting thing about this budget is I think it's the first time in the history of Canada that Parliament had tabled before us a budget with no numbers. It was very hard. You know, I'm serious. It had numbers. Well, there were page numbers for one thing. And there were individual references to spending. Now, I'm not trying to be facetious about it, but you know, Kevin Page, who was our first parliamentary budget officer, has made the point very forcefully that the public purse, the responsibility for the public purse, rests with Parliament. And that in his opinion, parliamentarians do not have enough information about the fiscal health of the country or the budgets that get passed to actually pass them or not. And I have to say, I mean, I certainly agree with Kevin Page, but this budget, when I'm used to going to budget lockups. I've done them for years. I did them before I was ever elected. In the old days, pre-Mr. Harper, non-government organizations, and I was with Sierra Club, we were allowed into what was called lockup. So you could read the budget and digest it before the finance minister rose to speak. And obviously, because of budget secrecy, there's a reason that you'd be locked up. You go in, you surrender your cell phone at the door, and read the budget over a period of a couple of hours. And then you get to go out and try to explain what you think of it, praise the parts you like, criticize the parts you don't like, and so on. They don't any longer let environmental groups or development groups or other groups in lockup. But it means that I have a certain technique for reading budgets. I've been doing it for, well, certainly 15 years. So one of the things I always do is go to the back of the budget first and look for the summaries of what spending is going to take place department by department. And that was what was missing this year. So you couldn't figure out the total spending for any department, nor could you compare the total spending to any department to previous years. We couldn't begin to do that till we got to main estimates. And unfortunately, main estimates don't get debated in the House anymore. They have a very strange procedure of assuming that they should be passed immediately without scrutiny. So I've got some problems with the level of control or knowledge that we have as members of Parliament. In any case, the budget led to an omnibus budget bill. This one was not as devastating as C-38 and C-45 from the 2012 budget, but budget 2013 did lead to this omnibus budget bill C-60, which is one of the many bills passed in the spring session of Parliament. And what happened in terms of my activities, I think probably most of you will know that I found a rule that no other MP had ever noticed that said that members of Parliament who weren't members of a committee could actually could present amendments at the report stage of the bill, which is when the Parliament as a whole is assembled, and you vote all of Parliament on amendments at report stage. So I found this rule that said I could do that, and that's how I had, what was it, 400 and some amendments to C-38. Well, you may not be surprised to hear that Mr. Van Loan, the Conservative government House leader, doesn't like it when I put forward amendments. So in the fall of 2012, this was one of my better moments of the last year, happier moments, was that in the fall of 2012, Peter Van Loan, Conservative House leader, made a motion to the Speaker of the House that was specific to me. This is rather unusual. That the Member of Parliament for Saanich-Gulf Islands should not be allowed to put forward these amendments. Yeah. And the Speaker said, well, what Peter Van Loan said was he proposed as an alternative that whenever I brought forward amendments, they should take one as sort of a test amendment and put it to a vote. And if it was defeated, then none of the other amendments should be heard. Yeah. Now, the Speaker of the House gave a very good ruling in response to that. But unfortunately, he left Mr. Van Loan some wiggle room. So the good part that I was happy about last fall was he said, in a parliamentary democracy, every member of parliament has a right to contribute to the development of legislation. And a member of parliament who's not a member of committee, this is where I found this strange rule, if a member of parliament isn't a member of committee, they have a right to bring forward amendments at report stage. And the Speaker of the House further said, which was great news, and I think every Canadian should have had this good news, the Speaker of the House said this is a democracy. You don't hear that a lot, but anyway, and he said, I don't hate to be facetious about it, but it really is where our democracy is hanging by a thread. But Speaker Scheer said this is a democracy, and he said to me privately, he said, you know, it would be ridiculous. It would be as if we have a speech from the throne, and from then on, there was no point doing anything else because the Conservatives have the majority, everything's going to pass that they want, nothing that they don't want is going to pass, so why hear from any of the opposition members? I mean, that's the logical extension of what Peter Van Loan was saying. Anyway, part of what Speaker Scheer's ruling that I was very happy that he ruled that I was allowed to continue to put forward my amendments at report stage. But he said, as long as there is no other opportunity for the member of Saanich-Gulf Islands or members in her position to put forward amendments to legislation, then you can't shut down her rights at report stage. So they went to the drawing board and they figured out how to give me a so-called opportunity. And what happened on Bill C-60, the omnibus budget bill this year, was that the Finance Committee sent me an invitation that I was invited to submit my amendments to them first. Since I'm not a member of the committee, I couldn't actually table my own amendments. They wouldn't give me temporary committee membership, that would have been better. But they would deem my amendments to have been tabled and presented, and they allowed me 1 minute per amendment to explain the purpose of the amendment and speak to it. But I wasn't allowed to respond to questions from other members, or I had Scotty Bryson from the Liberal Party said, oh, I like this amendment, but I'd like to suggest a friendly amendment. And he turned to me and said, is that friendly? And the chair wouldn't let me answer. I had my minute. Right? So it was a very odd process. Now, unfortunately, I did try putting forward amendments at report stage, and I did a long point of order as to why the opportunity I'd had in the committee wasn't a satisfactory or equal opportunity to other members, and therefore shouldn't preclude my ability to put forward amendments at report stage. I won't go into all the details, just to say that the Speaker didn't rule with me. So I spent a lot of the spring running from committee to committee. Somehow all the chairs of all the committees all at once decided to invite me. So I was going from committee to committee. Sometimes they were sitting at the same time. So I'd run from one committee meeting after the ritual slaughter of my amendments to go forward to another committee for the and I actually missed one where I raced in the door and I was just seconds too late for my amendments to the bill that has well, that's a very sad bill that got passed by unanimous consent, by the way. All the parties worked on this one to allow seismic testing inside the new Sable Island National Park and directional drilling under it. So, the spring session of Parliament, just to add one other thing that happened, which is why the prorogation this time is actually normal, is that the government House Leader put forward a motion, which of course Conservatives voted for, that we were going to sit till midnight every night starting May 20th till Parliament adjourned at the end of June. This was initially, as far as I'm concerned, a tactic to try to get the opposition parties to agree to an early adjournment so people could go back earlier in the summer. There was initially talk that we were going to adjourn in mid-June. But if there was a serious effort to find a compromise for adjournment, the problem was that none of these parties trust each other enough to admit that they all want to go home for the summer. They're all poised waiting to say, we were here ready to work and you wanted to go home for the summer. So nobody would meet in the middle. Now, I didn't care. I didn't think we should go home early for the summer. I was fine with it. But I was the only member of Parliament who was there every night till midnight. The other parties, as you probably know, work on shifts. So there had to be just sort of a bare minimum quorum in the room. So it was a very tiring month for me. And in the month, the last month, May 20th to June 20th, 19 government bills got royal assent, 16 government bills got through third reading. So that means and some of them started and went through all stages through the month of May and June. All debates were abbreviated. So sitting till midnight, sometimes if any one stage earlier in the day ran late, a midnight adjournment happened at 1:30 in the morning. And this was, of course, this didn't include Fridays, but Monday to Thursday, we sat to a minimum of midnight every night. Basically, they cleared their calendar. There's almost nothing left on the order paper of government bills. Mr. Harper got every single bill that he would have cared about passed, plus a lot they didn't care about much. It was frustrating because on some of these bills, all of us in the opposition supported the government bill. There's some that were just so, let's see, the Safer Witnesses Act. This was a C-51, just as an example. It was a bill to provide better protection to people who were testifying in a criminal matter where they were under some threat. A better protection of witnesses before a trial. Nobody was opposed to it. But we still had the same formulaic debate where we had to have, so in some cases, you wanted, like on C-60, which was a lot of bills put together, the omnibus budget bill, the issue that probably people in this room may care the most about, there were two that I think were really critically damaging about C-60. None of them affected the environment, but one was interfering with collective bargaining of Crown corporations, which specifically affects CBC, as well as Via Rail, a lot of Crown corporations. But what it said was the political side of government can appoint someone to sit in the room during the collective bargaining and actually insist on the management side of negotiations, reporting through so the government could control terms of work and conditions of work. In the case of CBC, terms and conditions of work can include the assignments that journalists get, where they're posted, how much staff they have if they're in the field. There was a group letter from every eminent retired Canadian journalist to the committee to say, don't let this happen. Joe Schlesinger and Don Newman and a whole roster of prominent journalists. Patrick Brown used to be CBC's China reporter, who's one of my constituents now because he lives on Pender. But all of these very eminent journalists said this is wrong in principle. You don't have political interference in collective bargaining for the CBC. The other piece of C-60 that was worrying was changing the tax treatment of credit unions to make it much harder for credit unions to compete with commercial banks. So there were other little wrinkles in there. I presented amendments. Oh, one of the things that happened in C-60, I shouldn't gloss over, was the elimination of CEDA, the Canadian International Development Agency, as a standalone agency, and folding its operations in to the Department of Foreign Affairs. There were a number of pieces to C-60 because it was your usual omnibus 400-page kind of bill. But the majority of it was changes to the tax code that were non-controversial. And then there were these pieces I've mentioned, plus a few others. So C-60, all of the bills that were passed through the month of May and June really cleared the agenda. That one I would have liked to have debated longer. As I was mentioning, the debates on the bills that everyone agreed on, I would have liked to say, and I did sometimes have my question to, why are we debating this? If we could put this to a vote right now, every single member of Parliament in this place and every party in this place supports this bill. So why don't we pass this bill now and give ourselves some more time to debate the bills that are controversial? That was not well received. Yeah. So that was the session of Parliament that brought us to the end of June. It was a rough, I have to say, it was a rough session. Physically rough, and also there were some, the saddest bill for me to see passed was the one that I've mentioned about seismic testing and directional drilling on Sable Island, creating a national park that allows the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Board to have superior regulatory powers in a national park, superior to Parks Canada. And it is a dangerous precedent, and I was devastated by that one, and it happened right at the very end of the session. So now we have had the news that there's going to be prorogation. The normal use of prorogation, and other prime ministers have always prorogued, if they have come to a point where the speech from the throne agenda that they put forward has pretty much run out of steam, and it's time for a new speech from the throne and new legislation. The one piece, I'll leave you with some good news, and then I'll open it for questions. I think a lot of you will know that I've put forward a private members bill for a national Lyme disease strategy. I'm now in, at least when we adjourned, and I don't think anything, private members bills and positions of private members bills are protected during prorogation. In other words, I don't slide back to the beginning. If it was a government bill on the order paper and there's prorogation, those bills slide back to the beginning and have to start over. But it's understood in principle that for a private member's bill to get anywhere near debate and second reading, they hold position even when the House prorogues. So my bill is now slated to be fourth up whenever we get back to the House. And I'm hoping, and I'm just so hoping, because last I checked in with a lot of people, I think I've got the votes for it to pass. A lot of conservatives support my bill. So unless they're told they can, it's because they have a lot of people in their communities with Lyme disease who want this bill to pass. So I'm cautiously optimistic that I can get that bill passed before, well, it'd be nice to have it passed before 2014, but who knows? We don't know when we're going back for sure. Now there may be, I know there's a lot of concerns that people will have about what's going on in Syria, other questions you may have about the press conference, Andrew Weaver, and I saw Adam Olson come in earlier. Adam and Andrew and I had a press conference yesterday on the material about how much money is being spent in the federal government in support, as we view it, in support of the Enbridge project. But